Hello humans, welcome back to these video series. I know I told you guys we'll be making a proper rig in this video, but there's been a slight change of plans. I figure we might as well stick to the already established format, and we're going to go over the skinning menu, because if you notice, past the skeleton there is a skin menu. And to be fair, in order to properly make a rig, I need to go over the constraints. In other words, to explain to you guys how the whole hierarchy system works, parenting different joints to each other, eliminating different rotation axes, etc. This is basic. The constraints essentially allow you to set up greater control over your rig, and only after that you basically would bind the skin. But because they're one after another, I figure we might as well just go over it before we go into the full rigging process here. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create the joints here. I'm going to open up the tool settings with this. I should probably get rid of this as well after that. Okay. Now, before that, it used to be that once you hold the tilde key, it's the top left corner of your keyboard between the one, the tab, and the escape keys. It would enable you to basically place your joints at the center of your geometry, because that is important, by the way. You want to be placing your geometry in the center of these faces, right? You have to be in the middle of it. Like joints are not bones, remember that. Joints are essentially points, like I already told you, that they affect different vertices and essentially deform them. So you shouldn't think of joints and skeletons as the real-life skeleton. So usually it is best to have your joints in the middle of your geometry so as to promote the best possible deformation when it comes to animating. So how do we do that? Well, you see, Maya, with this little settings called projected centering, you should probably keep it on all the time. It's going to take the normals of all of these, like the inverted normals of all of these faces here, and it's going to basically ray trace them, and where they intersect, this would be the center of your geometry. All right, now for some reason I can't get it to work right. It used to work properly. I don't know what's wrong, but essentially you just click and it should place your joints inside your object centered, which, however, in this case it didn't. If you notice here, it's definitely not centered. So I'm not too sure what's the big deal here and why it's not working. I wasn't able to fix it. But what we're going to do, we're just going to create 3 joints with projected centering on. 3 joints like so, right? We're not going to align them or orient them or anything. This is not a proper rigging that we're going to be doing. It's just an example. But we do want to align them sort of okay. So I'm going to press enter to exit the tool here. And I'm going to go into the side view. Usually when you're placing joints, you'd want to be placing them in an orthographic view and then sort them out as you work. So you basically grab this joint here, move it a little bit to the left, and grab this joint, move it a little bit to the left here, to the right, and then basically set up your deformation points here so that you can comfortably work with your object, okay? Once you're done on one orthographic view, you would go to the top. For example, notice that they're misaligned, they're not in the center. So what you would do, you would grab one of the joints, you'd move it the root, and just eyeball it so that it's sort of okay. Like I said, usually the projected centering should do this for you. I'm not too sure. Maybe this is not a cylindrical shape. Maybe that's why it's not working the way it's supposed to be working, but who cares? Okay, so there's that. Now that we have our joints established, I'm going to close this menu here. Well, maybe I shouldn't have, because it's going to pop up again. But the first thing we have to do is bind the skin, right? We already have the joints, so we have to basically shift-click the mesh, which is going to be affected by our skeleton. And we're going to go to bind skin, and we're going to open the menus here. So, when it comes to the bind skin options, you need to be fairly well, let me just reset the settings here. You need to be fairly well aware of all these settings, because they can have a fairly high impact on the quality of your skin bind. The first one is, the first setting here is to bind, choosing basically where to bind the mesh to. Usually it's best to leave the joint hierarchy on because, well, you want to usually bind it the whole skeleton to the whole mesh. But there's definitely other options, just like, for example, bind it only to the selected joints, or just the object hierarchy. After that, you've got the bind method, and that's the most important bit. I'm not going to go over the other ones because I've never really used them, never had to. Geodesic voxel usually yields the best results. But essentially what a voxel is, I'm just going to go ahead and deselect this, and I'm going to hide both these losers here. I'm going to hide this and hide that. And I'm going to create a, come on then. Do I need to, really? I'm not in object mode? There we go. I'm going to create a plane, and we're going to take a look at this for a second. If we take a look from the top view and focus into it, this is not unlike a pixel, okay? This is definitely not unlike a pixel because this is essentially what it is. Once you zoom out far enough, the pixel, which is a square, will turn into a very small, tiny dot. And once you have enough of them, you can actually construct a picture. That's what a pixel is. However, when it comes to voxels, they're basically 3D representations of pixels. So if we go over here and take a look at this again, this is a voxel, okay? And seeing all these sub Ds, by the way, you could actually imagine that this is a small square as well. So this whole square is made of many small squares, even though on the inside it's just empty, right? But you can easily imagine that this square is made of many small ones. You could actually even, like, maybe I should illustrate by duplicating this and moving it like this. Well, okay, let's be thorough. Let's be thorough and move this thing onto the, I don't know, this corner here, and then snap it over here, right? And then duplicate this, and then grab these, I don't know, move this thing over here, right? And then duplicate this stuff, move it up, well, with a snap, and then do this again. Now, if we take a look here, well, ideally, to be fair, this is what a voxel would be. Let me just build one for you guys. Might as well. So here's the. Did I just not select everything? Okay. Duplicate, move it to the left. See, for some reason, this is not duplicating the bits that I want. Come on then. Over here. Over to this pixel here. Okay, this vertex, and then we should be able to duplicate this. Yes, we should be, and there we go, we just did. So here's our voxel. Okay, this is a voxel, and as you see, it is made by many squares. Okay, each and every one of these objects is a square, right? And you can move it out. Let me just, I probably should center the pivot. I need to create a shortcut for this, really, pivot centering. But essentially what this is, this allows you to create a 3D cube made of smaller 3D cubes, okay? So the more cubes you have inside this little cube is going to be a resolution. And this is exactly what Maya is going to be doing. I'm going to delete these, and I'm just going to unhide these suckers. So this is exactly what geodesic voxel does, right? So if we select both of these again, and the bind method is geodesic voxel, this mesh will be broken down into many voxels. And the resolution down here, if you take a look here, that says resolution, is basically going to say how many cubes are you going to have within this sphere. I'm not sure how exactly this resolution is calculated, 256 cubed, so is it like per unit, per centimeter, or like as in per Maya units? I'm not sure, but I usually just set it up to max. It's going to take about 10 seconds, and obviously it depends on the complexity of your shape. But at the end of the day, this is going to give you a much better bind, and you know, this is the result that you're looking for anyway, unless you're iterating over different binds. The next is the weight distribution. Usually you should just leave it over to distance. It essentially tells Maya how will these joints affect the vertices. And speaking of weights, I think I should explain to you how weights work as well. All of them are normalized, okay? And what that means is that the value of a weight of a particular vertex is going to be from 1 to 0. So if we go and grab a particular vertex, let's say this one. Now this vertex, assuming it's bound, like once we do the bind, it's probably going to be bound to this joint. And this joint will have a particular strength. Once we move it, it will affect the vertices closest to it a lot more than it will affect the vertices further away from it. And this distance essentially is the way it's going to calculate. Obviously, it could go for neighbors, but this is the algorithm that's going to be that we're going to use. The max influences bit here is basically going to say that this vertex can only be affected by 4 joints in total, not more. Okay, because essentially, if we say, right, so this joint will have a 0.5 influence, 50% influence over this vertex. Now, this would mean that if we had 3 more joints, they would have to each use 0.20 or something like that, 0.18 in order to get the, split the difference between each other, right? So this would mean that the more of these max influences you can set up, the more vertices, the more joints can a vertex be affected by. I hope this makes some sense. I mean, I'm not trying to confuse you guys, but usually 4 is just fine. And I think you should by default leave the maintain max influences because once we start modifying this, you don't want to be influencing one vertex, with too many joints, unless it's a very specific scenario. Okay, remove unused influences. That's just fine. Colorized skeleton is also quite cool. It's going to make this skeleton colorful, and who doesn't like colors? Include hidden selection on creation. I really don't know why would you want to hide a selection before you bind something, but hey. And after that, you've got the fall off. And the fall off is quite simply, it's explaining currently it's 0.2. It means that from each vertex onward, the strength of the effect is going to be dropping by 20%. So this vertex, if this vertex has 100% influence, then the next one would have a 80% influence. 60, 40, 20, 0. So the last vertex here will have no influence from the same bone that had a vertex that was influencing this one here. Okay, so I hope you understand how this is going on. This is essentially a fall off. In other words, like a gradient, right? It's gonna drop the weight on it. And after that, obviously, you've got the resolution and the validate voxel state, which you should do, by the way, because, well, essentially, this will just make sure that there's no errors after you're done with your bind. So again, I'm going to select the root of our joint chain here, and then I'm going to shift select the mesh, and I'm going to click bind skin. Now, this will take a while. In this case, not a lot because, it's a small object, only 20,000 polygons, give or take. Well, actually, it's 15,000 exactly. So, okay, now our joints are bound. We're not going to bother too much about the fact that our alignment is complete garbage. By now, you should have them aligned, by the way. So I'm just going to go ahead and take a look at what we've got. Well, it's not bad, right? We've got some rotation action here, which is just fine. We can move our object up and down. Obviously, there's some issues here. But these usually get fixed once you get the major pieces out of the way. You probably have to have split the difference here. But anyway, so let's lift this sucker up. Oh my God, no. This is not good. I'm just gonna lift it like this. Oops. See, we already have problems. As you can see, this does not look nearly as good as it should be, and that's because the object is not aligned. As you can see, these are the problems that you will run into once you start making misaligned joints. Well, let's just leave it at that and see what's going to happen this way. I think we should be able to move this in a world space, so I think I should be able to change the movement points here. I'm just going to open the channel box here. or maybe not. Maybe I should open the tool settings. And I believe axis orientation world. I think there was a way to go into this world as well with your control, maybe. No, control shift. Yes, there we go. Object world. So in our case, we're going to use the world, and I'm just gonna zero everything out as this at this stage. Oh, my bad, my bad. This was not. You're not supposed to zero out the translates, but the z-axis will be zeroed out. I think this did not go well, but anyway. We've created some deformation, all right? That's the only thing that matters. Just go and create, and just rotate this in world as well. Something like this, and then something like this. So this would be what we want it to look like when it comes to the joint shape. Just, you know, just an example. This is definitely not what we want as a result. But let's just look at it this way and just stay with it for now like that. I'm just going to go back into object here, so that I don't accidentally start moving stuff in the world space next time around. Now, as you can see, the binding is kind of finicky. Okay, our first option here is to go into the vertex mode and just select these vertices. And what we could do, we could hammer the skin weights here. This is an option here called hammer skin weights. We could hammer it, but this is not really going to help us much, because this will essentially, what the hammer does, it grabs. As you can see, it grabs essentially the nearest vertex weights and just averages them. I believe that's what happens. But it definitely is an improvement, right? I mean, this is way better. This is way better than the previous one. So we've hammered the weights down, but there's definitely a lot more work to be done. And this is where your Paint Skin Weights tool comes in. And it's a pretty big tool. All of these options here, mirror skin weights, copy them, smooth them, copy the vertex weights, prune small weights, etc. Well, maybe except the prune. Almost all of these are available in your Paint Skin Weights tool. So I'm going to open it up. And clearly, we got a bunch of stuff here. I'm going to turn the heat ramp off first, so that you notice this is the default setting of the... let me just reset the tool anyway. So this is what you're going to be seeing, right? Currently, we have selected the joint 1 tool, which is our root over here on the left. And the white is how much influence that joint has over the deformation of a particular object. As you can see, it's very strong all the way up until this joint here, which is our second joint, which has very little influence on this side and a lot of influence on this side. And joint number 3 has barely any influence at all. So in order to fix that, we're going to have to paint some influences. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that first of all, we need to understand that the color ramp setting here is very useful for us, because the shades of white are not the best way to figure out how much influence you have over here, right? I mean, is this 100% influence, or is this 9.9? Like, this looks white, doesn't it? Well, let's take a look and double check. Here's the value of our paint tool, right? It's currently 1. I'm gonna click this eyedropper, and I'm gonna grab this setting. Okay, it is 1. Imagine that. What about this setting? Well, this isn't 1. This is 0.9, whatever. But usually, you'd want to still have an idea of how much of an influence a particular spot has, and therefore, use the color heat ramp. So as you can see, this should be 1. These are less than 1, I believe. Wow, this heat ramp is screwing up. It's not supposed to be. This has to be 100% 1, the white stuff. But this is definitely weird. But anyway, at least you know the fall off. Now, first and foremost, notice that there's still these weights over here. They still have a value, which is 0. Okay. I'm not sure. I thought this was supposed to be black and white, but hey, whatever. So what we can do, we can prune some of the weights, meaning that this joint here has a lot of influence on this side. What we could do, we could prune the small weights. We could say, let's say anything that's above 0.2 should be gone. Right, it will be just basically zeroed out. So I'm going to prune. You will quickly see that we have a lot of our fall off gone. Okay, a lot of our fall off is gone. It's actually been, sorry, my bad. It's been pruned to 0, basically to the closest one. If it's 0.5, yeah, you're kind of screwed. But yeah, It's been pruned to 0, and maybe 0.2 was a little bit too strong. So I'm going to go ahead and redo this with 0.0, I don't know, 5. What's going to happen? Apply. Well, this looks a little bit better, but still too strong. So, okay, what about 0.1? How about that? Alright, this is a little bit better. Okay, so here's our most of this stuff gone that we don't need on this side, and we sort of had a change on this side. Now let's go ahead and talk about our modes here, because this tool has a lot of modes, and it's to be honest with you, it's quite difficult to actually figure out on your own the first time you use it. Before we do that, I just want to point your attention towards the normalized weights here. And I recommend you enable the weight normalization, which should be on by default, okay? This means that every time you take a swab at this, it's going to normalize the weight so that it's between the 0 and 1 range. So there's that. Now, let's go ahead and just go into the mode. Currently, we're in the paint mode, and I think it's quite self-explanatory what it does. Essentially, what happens is you select a particular joint. In our case, let's select the middle joint, or let's just select maybe this one. And let's go ahead and say that the value that we're going to be painting with is 0, like right here. The opacity is going to be 1, so 100% of this value will be applied. And that we're going to replace whatever we're painting over. So take a look here. See the replace bit? Yes, so that's exactly what we'll be doing. We'll be replacing the values under the cursor with a 0. So we'll be zeroing stuff out. So the moment we start doing that, you will see that we have an immediate upgrade over our current situation, right? We can see the deformations here, but it's still not done well enough, because we still got loads of problems here. We really gotta paint properly here to get this thing running right. But then again, this is a problem with the rig as well. So this is definitely not something you should this is definitely not something you should be bitching to Maya about. Okay. So this is how the paint works when it comes to skin weights. Obviously, there's also an add, so you can add a particular value. Now, in this case, because this is white, we're not really going to be adding much if we start painting over, right? We might add a little bit here. We're adding 0 right now. But if we start painting white, you will see that we're quickly overtaking everything here on this side. So this is not what we want. On the other hand, you use the add, you could actually use the minimum and maximum value here in order to say, okay, I'm going to have the minimum value will be -1 and the maximum value will be -0.5. And as such, every time we add 0.5, we'll be subtracting half of what we have here. As you can see right here, right? We're subtracting half of the already established skin weights. And every time you pass through, this will happen. So you can keep subtracting and subtracting and subtracting. I really rarely use this. I think it's better just to use replace, but it's just a personal preference. Obviously, the scale, there's also a scale. I really don't know why would you use the scale. It's just beyond me. Let me just go for a minimum and maximum here. I don't even know why would you use the scale. But this essentially multiple scales. I think it multiplies the the weight value by whatever you've set up here. So by 0 in this case, which would be zeroing it out. I don't know why would you want to use it. Never seen anyone use it. And again, there's the smooth, which is, by the way, available to you with the shift key. Remember, shift is smoothing stuff out, so we could smooth these a little bit. Although in this case, there's not much to smooth because the fall off here is so drastic that the smoothing is not going to do much for us. Obviously, you can increase the value, but let's just say that we want to be painting with 0.7. Let's just assume this for a second, and we're going to use the fall off profile, which is a soft brush. Okay, there's a fall off once you press something here. There's a fall off here. Notice how there's a fall off. Okay, that's exactly what we're going to be doing. Obviously, there's other options. You can go into a square brush, which this will allow you to essentially paint over vertices. Like so, but nobody uses that. Usually people just use the regular one. You can go to a little bit softer brush as well. This is super soft, which is like it Gaussian, whatever you want to call it. It's definitely useful. I mainly use these three. This super hard one is usually rarely useful to a point where it's worth working with it. But hey, it's all about what you need to be done. Now, if I go ahead and paint 0.7 over here, I'm going to replace it, right? So I'm going to go ahead and paint this at 0.7. Notice that I'm immediately changing the value of all the objects which are here. However, I could also press the the control key to invert my settings. So currently I'm at 0.7. If I invert this, it would be 1 minus 0.7 would be 0.3. So I would be painting with 0.3. Okay, this is 0.3. 0.7, 0.3. All right. So definitely use these shortcuts here. And again, you can use shift after that to smooth whatever it is you have to smooth. Obviously, you can pick a particular weight from the eyedropper here. And one other thing, by the way, you could also go ahead and flood something. So in our case, we could select the first joint. We could flood it with 0.7. And now the first joint is going to flood. Basically, it's going to have an effect on the whole object. Now, this is not very useful, you might say, and it certainly is not in this case. But the flood is more useful when you go into the select mode, or in the paint select mode. You could be painting selection. So you could select this bit here, and then you could flood it. If we go into our, obviously, paint tool, and then we flood it. So paint select is definitely useful, but usually I find myself working in select. So you want to be selecting vertices. Let's say we're using the first joint, so let's just say we want to make this 0. All right, make all this, well, can I select the vertices, please? Thank you. So we select these vertices here, and we're going to flood them with 0 to say that this joint, the first joint, is not going to have an effect, any effect whatsoever over these objects. So there we go. We're just going to flood them with 0. Boom. And as such, we've currently created a problem because the fall off here is ridiculously small. The next thing we could do, obviously, is going back into paint, select our geometry, and then we could start painting back so that we get some better results with the values. See, the problem here, by the way, is that even though the brush size shortcut works, the brush magnitude does not. Notice that I'm pressing M and I cannot change my value, which is a real big bummer. I kind of want it. Like, it would be very nice if you could do that on the fly, but in this case you have to be quite, fairly precise. We could grab this tool here and maybe start replacing some of these settings, some of these vertices here with, whatever it is you want to do. Obviously, this is not ideal because you don't want all the vertices to be doing that. So you could freeze stuff. You could freeze them here, but this only is applicable to joints. I'm not sure you can freeze when it comes to skin weights. I'm pretty sure you are not able to. Let me just re-enable the tool here. So yeah, there's definitely something to be played around with, but at the end of the day, it's like geometry. At the end of the day, this is really your main issue. Okay, you just got to replace stuff. You got to play around with this and figure out the best way to manipulate your mesh. Okay, because this is a very very sharp fall off. Obviously, you could go into the attribute editor and go. Let's say we're going to select these vertices here, which are already selected. We could go into the attributes editor. I think it should open them. Okay, maybe I should just open it on myself. No, it won't give you. I think there was a way to adjust, to basically get a there was a way to get a matrix of all this stuff. I'm just not sure what was it, or where did you get it from? Was it Windows, modeling editors, animation, shape editor maybe? I'm not too sure. It doesn't really matter in this case because you probably sort it out on your own once you figure it out that you need it. In our case, this is, for example, what we're going to be doing, right? We're going to go over we're going to flood everything with 0 right now, okay? I'm going to go ahead and select geometry, flood everything with 0 on this joint, flood it with 0 on this joint, and flood it with 0 on this joint. Currently, you will notice that we essentially unbound the skin right now because there's not much happening. All right. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select these vertices here, and I'm going to say flood to 1. Obviously, we need to select the joint first, and then we're going to flood to 1. 1. There we go. And then I'm going to select this joint here. I'm going to do the same here while I select the vertices. See, the thing is, the weird bit is that I think there is a way to get the fall off. I'm just not sure how it was done. But at the end of the day, this is just a trial of the object itself. I'm going to select geometry. Well, come on, man. Select it, paint, flood. Jesus. Right, and the rest of it is going to have to be split between this joint. So now that we select the second joint here, we could start, select geometry, we could start painting in between. And that's essentially it. You just got to start fiddling around with it and see what works best. Obviously lock these two joints so that we work only on this bit, so we don't change the options on these other joints, and then we can start painting and replacing weights here. At the end of the day, this is going to be affecting your deformation. So obviously this is not ideal. This is definitely not good. But just play around with it, soften it, whatever. You can increase the intensity here. You can even get a bigger brush. Instead of using the Gaussian blur, you can actually be maybe using another one. If we unlock these joints, by the way, let's say these two, notice that I can immediately change the geometry, okay? And this is definitely not something that you want to be doing without knowing what's going to be the first thing to happen. But by the way, ideally, it's not always best to start painting over the object itself. You could probably use a bigger brush in this case and simply paint a bigger picture. So maybe something like this, like once you play around with it, you would grab a bunch of objects. But as you can see, I'm simply taking over and I'm basically replacing the values of the other joints, which is definitely not what you need. Okay, so make sure to lock your joints and make sure to work on your hierarchy here. But we're gonna go into a little bit more in depth once we're done with the skin painting tool. So there's that. Obviously, you can still hammer the weights. You can select, let's say I'm going to select these vertices here. Oops, my bad. Let's say I select these vertices here. I'm going to hammer the weights. Where is it? There we go. And this should sort of increase my. There we go. It should fix some of my problems. I believe I have soft select on. That's what's happening. I kind of thought that soft select you would be able to. With soft select, you should be able to, how should I say this? I think you should be able to use soft select with the paintbrush tool, weight paint, but it never works for me for some reason. So there's that. So there's really no need to be having it on. Anyway, basically keep selecting these, just keep hammering the weights, and obviously it depends on your geometry and how your neighboring weights are done. And it requires a lot of fiddling. It's a finicky job, all right? It's not something that you go ahead and do in like one fell swoop. Be like, yeah, man, I'm gonna take half an hour and do my, skin weights. No, that's not how it works. It's definitely gonna be a time-consuming in almost every scenario, unless you're some super pro kind of guy where you have fairly easy, fairly well-established skin bind. You will have to be playing around with these settings quite a lot. Okay, so it's not going to be on this macro scale where you just go ahead, yeah, I'm going to bind this stuff. And usually you won't be using such a high density object anyway. So in our case, we're going to retopologize so that we have an easier understanding on how we're going to work with this. Because in general, what you do, you basically smooth your object out. Currently, it's smooth, as you can see here. I'll smooth it with a cage. I'll probably exit the tool as well. So as you can see, currently the object is not smooth, and then I'm going to smooth it with 3 and you can see it's going to have definitely a lot more polygons, 250,000 to be precise. So there's definitely a lot of stuff that you need to do before you actually start binding it, because the more faces you have to paint here, notice that is a lot of faces, right? And once you start painting onto them, this is going to be a problem. That's why you need a smaller polygon count mesh, so you can actually, you can see which vertices you're affecting instead of just grabbing 50,000 vertices and just hoping that you land on the right one and you don't miss a particular a vertex. Okay. But anyway, once you're done with your skin painting, let's assume that we're done. You can try to basically move your object in a particular fashion, and then once that happens, you put it in a particular stress position, see what problems are there in the deformation. In our case, we got loads of problems because, first of all, the skeleton's all wrong. This is a travesty, to be honest with you. When it comes to modeling, this is a disaster. So in this case, you'd be probably better off just forgetting about the whole thing in general. But this is not how you bind the skin. All right. Once you're done with playing around, you select your mesh and you go into bind skin, bind pose. This is your bind pose. So this shouldn't this looks just fine. But if we go ahead and select the influence again, select the joint here and we move it up, notice how we have problems with our weights, right? So we definitely, our paint weights, weights are definitely not painted correctly. We have loads of issues. So definitely you need to be thinking before you start animating. You need to sort your weights out. There's also other options here, like the mirror skin weights. For example, you can mirror your weights across a particular instance. I think you don't even have to be across. I don't even think you need to be in the skin weight tool, but let's just select our skin weights here and go ahead and mirror our skin weights. So let's select the first joint, maybe the second joint. If I can actually go into paint mode, would be nice. So look at our first joint has like this weird, very weird setup. The first joint is very, very strange influences here. All right, but let's say I paint something over here on this side, and then I just replace this. All right. So I've replaced something. We could add. There we go. I've added to our current situation here, to the problem. I've essentially increased the problem. So let's just say we want to copy this over. Now you could copy in many different ways. You can mirror the skin weights over here. Now where is it? Jesus, where did it go? I'm pretty sure you could you could do this through the tool, but maybe I'm wrong. That's why there's a mirror skin weights on this side. So you choose which axis you want to mirror your skin weights on. Let's say you want to drop it over on the other side. You use basically say along which axis do you want to do this. And by the way, in order for this to work, your mesh has to be centered in the world, so that it has an idea, because it's going to use the world as a axis. The world axis. It's not going to be using the object, I believe. All right, so let's just say whatever, YZ. Let's see what happens, and it mirrors it across the other side. I think, yes. So it's equal on both sides right now. And then once you're done with that, you could go ahead and mirror across the X and Y, I think. No, this did not work. At X and Z. Yeah. So there we go. It's mirrored across X and Z, and I think this should have just created a nice solid deformation in this case, let's say. Joint number 2, number 3, they all got sort of okay joints, because notice that this essentially normalizes everything. Obviously there's a bunch of other settings. You can change the directions, right? You can choose the surface association, like ray casting and closest component with the influences. But go into help here and take a look at these tool options, because they're just fine. They're quite fine. You can normalize, by the way. Maybe that's what I should have done before I mirrored it, but that's not an issue, because we could always go into our normalized weights and normalize all our weights in this way, in this fancy manner. I think there was a way, like, I don't remember right now. I'll show it to you once we start rigging, but there was a way to access each vertex. Like, there would be like a vertex grid here, a vertex spreadsheet, and you would have access to each vertex weight. You could do this manually. So I'm just not sure which way you got to that right now. Anyway, let's take a look at what will happen now. We could actually lift stuff, and again, we've got obviously loads of problems because this is not made to be the way it is right now. And usually you wouldn't want to be moving joints in general. Essentially, most of the time you'd want to be rotating joints. Essentially, most of the time you'd be just rotating the joints. Okay, you wouldn't be using the move tool for them. It's all about rotation. Moving joints is almost never a good idea. Okay, unless it's for placement. All right. Or maybe you want to stretch something, but then you could just scale the joints. But then again, you introduce all sorts of different problems here. Unless you scale like all of them at the same time, I think then you're gonna have uniform scale. But at any rate, this is it when it comes to painting a skin weight. Now there was one last thing that I want to mention, by the way. Oh yeah, you can also smooth the skin weights. Duh. Right, which is nice because you can do this object wide, okay, and you can split the different smear and you can have different iterations, etc. But anyway, what you want to do here is make sure not to delete your deformer history. In other words, every time someone says, "Oh, you've got a problem," go to edit and delete all by type and delete history. Look what happens. Now, this is not bound at all. Nothing happens. You essentially removed all of your deformers, and you cannot do this. You cannot use this anymore. So this is definitely a problem, because if you have a big enough object, okay, and you delete the history, you're gonna have a problem later down the line, because you're gonna lose all of your deformers. If you have any spline IK handles or whatever, these are all deformers. They will be gone, and you can imagine if you have 200 joints of the sort, all with different handles and constraints and all sorts of stuff, and maybe an IK spline for the spine, a bunch of other different modifiers, and at the end of the day, some schmuck tells you go ahead and delete all your history because you get stuck or the Maya crashes. You go ahead and do that, and you lose all of your deformers without even realizing it, because let's say you were working on something like, I don't know, moving a couple of verts around, and you just had a problem with some polygons or whatever. And only after about, let's say, 1 or 2 days, when you've done when you've done tweaking your model, you realize that your rig is essentially screwed, right? So what you want to be doing is always delete the non-deformer history, and only delete the deformers when you want to lock in your changes, okay? Because if I delete the history right now, let's go ahead and do that again. I could delete this, and I've essentially created a new mesh. Right? And I could use that. That's completely valid. I could use this for whatever reasons, like for whatever I want. But I can't go to bind pose, for example, because there is no bind pose. There's nothing I can do here to get it right. So make sure you know what you're doing when you're deleting stuff. Okay? And if you want to get rid of this, obviously you can just go to bind pose and then unbind the skin. However, when you're unbinding the skin, notice that you can keep the history, or you can bake the history in, so that next time you have a bunch of joints here, it will automatically be applied. So whenever you're detaching the skin, keep your history on if you want to just change the skeleton, and keep working when you attach it again. Don't delete the history. All right. So there's that. This is all where there is when it comes to skinning. It's a very tedious process. Nobody likes it. Well, maybe some people do. I definitely don't. I think it's the most annoying thing to do. I like rigging the stuff. I like putting the joints there. But when it comes to attaching the skin to the joints, that's a little bit mainly because of this tool. A lot of people find this tool to be invaluable, and it is indeed. However, I find it to be completely outdated, or some kind. It's a very cramped tool. All right, you've got a bunch of stuff here like hierarchies, then you've got your select modes, then you've got your paint select modes, assuming you go into paint select, then you've got your different operations. You got 4 operations. This is a ridiculous amount of operations to have just on one tool here. And then you've got your different profiles, which are only 3 when you need definitely more. There's no fall off settings. When you select stuff, vertices, you cannot select, you cannot soft select them. You should normalize the weights, by the way, for interactive, but that's obviously going to happen once you have a skin bind, so that doesn't matter. So yeah, the value cannot be modified with the M key, right? If you got a brush, you cannot modify the value. So that's a problem. You can modify the size of the brush, but that doesn't really count if we go into Paint Tool here. You cannot do that. Can I just select the geometry? Thank you. Notice that, oh, you can't even change the size of the brush unless you have a bound skin. Well, there's that. Maybe you will find this a little bit more intuitive than I did, but I never really enjoyed this tool. I never liked working with it. I much prefer just selecting vertices and just hammering the weights. Just hammer skin weight, select the vertex, press G, repeat. Select the vertex, press G, repeat. And then once you've hammered all the outsides, maybe you could start painting after that. But I'm usually very careful with my painting. I paint by vertex. I don't use this brush because I find it very, well, quite useless really, unless you're painting something very specific. Especially because you can't have something like a smudge. See, that's the problem I find with that. That's my problem with this tool. You don't have a smudge. You have to set the value. Let's say you want to be setting a 0.5, and it'll stay at 0.5. And unless you go in here and change it, let's say you want to do a Gaussian, right? Gaussian. Jesus, I can't pronounce the damn thing. Or let's say you want to modify the fall-off radius on this profile here. Now, obviously, there's a different pressures here, and there's like a stroke, which the stroke is the nice bit. I think this is the fall-off. And you can definitely use that, but it's just annoying that you have to just go back and forth between these two. There's no shortcut for it. B just increases your size, the size of your brush. But anyway, rant over. I'm sorry I kind of went into this rant, but at the end of the day, you're gonna have to use this tool whether you like it or not, because if you don't, you're gonna end up without. You're gonna suffer. Your skinning process is gonna be extremely painful, slow, and inefficient. Okay. All right, guys. That's it for this video. I'm gonna close this bit here. I'm gonna exit the tool, and in the next video we will probably do one of the following. We will we're gonna talk about constraints in the next video. All right. This is our last bit here, the constraint menu set, and it's quite important for the different how should I say, control objects that we're gonna have for our joints. Obviously, we're not going to have many joints, but it's still important to understand the workflow so that we don't create, we don't accidentally, let's say, rotate something 360 degrees and just twist it in half. Obviously, this is not going to happen with such a small object, and we really don't need that much precision and constraints for just a worm. But it's nice. But it's a nice thing to basically be able to work on, because you will definitely be using these constraints like aim and the pull vectors and the points and the orients, the parents. All of these constraints have their own purposes, okay? And you have to be using them, such as motion paths and such, okay? This is basically for animating and for rigging. This is an invaluable menu set, even more so than binding a skin weight, because you could bind skin weights with a heat map or whatever. You may not have to paint with a paint tool to do that, but the constraint menu set is imperative to understand it. So that's why we're going to devote a whole video to it. And after that, we can start actually rigging our character, well, our player character, the worm. We will rig it, skin it, create a control rig around it, which would be just 3 circles or something. And then we're going to go over the animation tool set. Notice that it's not going to be that long, because constraint we would have covered over here, and then deform we would have covered it over here, right? These are the same menu sets, so you would know what these are. The only difference would be that we have to go over key, which is fairly simple. Then you got the playback, which, well, it's a playback, right? We won't be playing it back that much, and this is not, I don't think you even need a menu set for this unless you're going to be recording a video. And the visualize bit, which is for editing the keyframes after the fact that you've already created them. At the end of the day, though, make sure to go over the bonus tools, by the way. I'll bring this up later down the line as well, but there's a channel called Maya Oh Maya, and the guy there works like he's a Maya guru, so he's definitely way better than me, and he'll definitely explain the bonus tools a lot better than I will. But if you don't want to bother, just take a look at these, see what they do. Well, most likely you will understand what they will do once you understand what the tool sets usually do. Let's say for modeling, you go into modeling and say select every nth edge in the loop range. So you know what a loop is, and let's say you have 50 edges in a loop. You want to select every third edge in that loop, and there you go. And they're nicely combined here, like in mesh stuff, components, faces, vertices, edges, normals, and mesh tools, etc. Same goes for rigging, right? You've got your you can rename new joints. You can create bones on a curve. Never seen a stretchy IK. No idea what that does. I think it's gonna stretch. Yeah, so a stretchy IK would be if your IK handle goes further away than the length of the skeleton, it'll stretch it. So, wow, that's actually pretty cool. I never knew that was in here. So yeah, you can definitely learn a bunch of cool stuff. You can even control set up arm, foot, set up back. No idea what these do. I'm gonna have to check these out myself. So yeah, there's definitely a bunch of stuff to be learned, and enjoy until the next time. And I'll see you when I see you. Bye bye.